Sound can have truly magical effects. In this video I'm going to be talking about how sound can change not only how you feel about things and your emotion, but actual reality itself. So I wanted to start off by talking about music in particular and how music can evoke memory and emotion and stuff like that, but I didn't just want to talk about the emotional impact of stuff. I wanted to start off this video by talking about music and notes and vibrational energies and how that can change not only your emotional state but your reality itself. Now there's some kind of crazy stuff that's going on with sound at the moment, and there are even some theories that go around that says that the pyramids of ancient Egypt were created using sound energy. Now I don't know how true that is, but there have been some really cool scientific advancements and discoveries recently that I think need discussing a bit more widely, and that's one of the reasons for this channel in the first place. First suggested in 2013, a study by Levitate et al., published in Noise and Health, suggested that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony can cure cancer. I'm not just going to pump out ideas here. I don't want this video demonetized. I'm actually going to cite the references here. And I'm not saying whether or not it can. Obviously, I'm not qualified for that sort of thing. But I do think it's interesting that these studies exist, and I'm going to tell you about them. It looked at breast cancer cells, specifically the MCF7 and MDA-MB231. I'm not really sure what those cells' names mean, but hopefully those in the know do. Now those cells were exposed to a very specific type of sound, specifically Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. As well as Beethoven, there was also Liget's Atmosphäres, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, and a bit of Mozart as well. The study found a shift in the cell's development, the cell's growth cycle, things like hormone binding, and a slight increase in cell death compared with those in a controlled study, and an increase in cancer cell death compared to those in a silent control. The headline at the time is that 20% of cancer cells died off just by listening to Beethoven. Not entirely true. Obviously there are some changes going on here that we can't necessarily account for, but the 20% not true. However, in a very recent study, it suggests that maybe that could go up to 20%. Now there's a lot of work in other journals, such as Nature, that have tried to replicate these studies and found that yes, there is some sort of influence going on, but maybe it's not quite as dramatic as 20%. That said, if you have cancer yourself, listening to classical music probably isn't a bad idea. It lowers the heart rate, that's been proven. It lowers your blood pressure, that's also been proven. It generally leads to relaxation, lower cortisol levels. All of these things are good for your general health. And so surviving cancer as a result of listening to specifically Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and a bit of Mozart probably isn't a bad idea anyway. Of course, there's also music therapy and generally feeling good. The cool thing about music in particular is it activates the reticular system within the brain, and what that does is to help with somatic markers and generation of memory, and not only generation but also recall of that memory too. In layman's terms, what that means is that just by listening to a certain type of song, that's one of the best ways of triggering a memory. Now everyone's got songs like this inside their head. They go to a restaurant, they hear a song on the radio or playing over the tannoy or over the house entertainment system, and suddenly it takes you back 35 years to when you were on a date with somebody else. Or, ideally, the person you're with, because otherwise it's a bit awkward, isn't it? My point is that music is a fantastic somatic marker, meaning it makes that mark inside your brain, creates those neural pathways, and then you remember things later on. But we're not just talking about that, we're talking about sound creating reality. Have you heard of the water study? Now the water study is one where you play music to water just as it's freezing, and the crystalline structures relate to the music that it's hearing. If you're listening to heavy metal music, or rather the water's listening to it, bear with me, I'll get there, then the water itself starts to freeze in ugly ways. That's the way the author described it. I quite like heavy metal music, it makes me feel relaxed, but I fully accept that other people don't like that sort of music. I will come back to this point. The fact is that in that study though, if you started playing pretty music, whatever that is, or orchestral music, church music, prayers, all of those sorts of pretty things, the crystalline structure of the frozen water looks much more beautiful. Now I think this is interesting in a couple of ways, because different people have different interpretations of different types of music. Some people don't like heavy metal? Personally, I do. Some people find that that's very aggressive music. Personally, I use it to relax and relieve tension, and yes, okay, maybe it is aggressive, but at the same time, I use that as a bit of a catharsis to try and get that emotion out rather than keeping it within me. And so I think maybe this is the point, that if you have that feeling towards the music rather than the music itself, it might well reflect what you're feeling about it rather than the music itself. And so this is one of the things that I think might be happening with the cancer cells. What I'd really like to see is a controlled trial with silence. One where people just imagine that they're listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony without the actual sound, and one where people are just talking to themselves or doing something other than thinking about music. I think a true controlled trial would not involve the music itself, but would involve people's minds. And I think this would be a really cool experiment. So scientists, if you're out there, please do that, because I'd love to find out whether it's the music itself or people's intent towards it. That may sound really wacko, but people are already doing this with particle physics and particularly with light and quantum computing. And they're saying, well, if you look at it, then the observation effect means that it changes state from a superposition into a single way of doing things. What that means is that it's the intent or the view of the person, the individual's gaze, that's affecting reality. And if that's the case, then maybe the music's having no actual effect. I told you that we were going to be talking about the creation of the pyramids, using sound, and sound levitation in particular. Currently, the main archaeological argument at the moment is that the pyramids were built for a tomb for a king, King Khufu in particular, or Pharaoh Khufu, about 5,000 years ago. And it was built by slaves. Really? There's around 20 million stones in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Each one of them weighs tons. 20 million times tons, it would take a very, very, very long time to place those things. Plus, with such precision that you can barely slip a piece of paper between the stones. No, I don't believe that slaves did that. Even if they did, how? We can't build the pyramids today with our current technology because we don't have the ability. We did try to build something fairly similar on a much smaller scale, and it broke the crane. So if we broke our modern equipment trying to do these things, surely the Egyptians wouldn't be able to do it just with levers and wood and all of those sorts of things. These things, some of them weigh 20 tons plus. The weight of each of these blocks alone is ridiculously high. Ah, they pushed them on sleds, did they? Nope. The sled itself would break or dig into the sand, and then, although we can't carbon date it, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are not 5,000 years old, probably more like 12,000 years, because there's water erosion, and water wouldn't have been there 5,000 years ago. It would have been there 12,000 years ago, especially the Younger Dryas impact event would definitely have caused water erosion. And so I don't think that they were built by the Egyptians. I think the Egyptians probably found them. Would they have used sound to levitate things? Again, maybe, but we don't know how. If we go back to the Old Testament and talk about the walls of Jericho falling down, that sounds an awful lot like resonant frequency, where the horns are blown and the walls come down, and that they were circling and blowing at a specific frequency. Well, that would suggest to me that yes, they knew something about sound back then that we've only just discovered in the last couple of 100 years, and that is resonant frequency. You may have seen footage of the bridge Galloping Gertie, where wind whistled down the valley and resonated the bridge at a particular frequency, and the whole thing started wobbling, and it was sort of a bit of a joke. I mean, people saw it and they thought, okay, well, yeah, that thing's wobbling because of the wind, until it collapsed. And it could have been foreseen, but we didn't really understand resonant frequency as much as we do now, and that was only within the last couple of 100 years. Now, if we go back further than that, commonplace science would say we don't know about resonant frequency, but even in the King James Bible, it seems like we did. Have we lost some of this ancient knowledge? I'd love to know what you think down in the comments. Click that like button, subscribe and ding that bell, and if you want to see more about time travel and stuff, have a look at this video. I think it's really cool. I'm going to be back next time with some more magical awesomeness, but until next time, as always,
stay magical.